What if the reason you feel so completely exhausted, like just down to your bones, isn't actually because you're failing to improve yourself, right? But because you're trying to improve a version of yourself that you were never supposed to be in the first place. Welcome to today's deep dive. I am so glad you're here with us. It's a really powerful thought to start with because we constantly hear that personal growth is all about accumulation, right? You wake up and the world is essentially screaming at you to optimize. You need to stack your habits, learn a new language, curate this flawless morning routine, and build mental resilience, and just acquire more traits. The default assumption is that you are a deficit and getting better means just piling things on top. But that accumulation mindset creates a massive cognitive load. We approach our lives like we're packing a suitcase for a trip where we don't actually know the destination, so we just throw everything in. More skills, more boundaries, more coping mechanisms. But today's deep dive is taking a completely different path. We're looking at a beautiful reflective narrative text about a woman named Destiny. And her experience fundamentally flips that whole script. The core argument we're exploring today is that true profound growth is rarely about addition. Most of the time, it's about subtraction. Let's unpack this because going from an addition mindset to a subtraction mindset, that's fundamentally challenges how you view your own personal journey. We aren't just talking about like decluttering your closet here. We're talking about unlearning. And to understand why we need to subtract, we have to first look at what we've been adding all our lives and what started it all in the first place. Destiny's story provides just a perfect lens for this. She hit a wall in her life, and not a wall of failure, but a wall of overwhelming hollow success. She was highly functioning, taking care of everyone around her, constantly achieving, but she experienced this moment of intense clarity where she realized that the beliefs driving her weren't actually hers. The standards she used to judge her daily worth were completely inherited from her family dynamics, her culture, the expectations she absorbed when she was a kid. Because you absorb these rules long before you have the cognitive language to say, wait, this is actually true. You just take them as facts of the universe. And for Destiny, it was a subconscious belief that her value was entirely dependent on her usefulness to other people. Like if she wasn't fixing a problem or mediating a conflict, she didn't feel like she had a right to take up space. And the psychological mechanism at play there is crucial. These inherited beliefs, they don't just magically attach themselves to us. They are adopted because they work. They serve a purpose. Destiny's narrative makes a sharp distinction here. At one point in her early life, making herself endlessly useful was a survival pattern. It was a behavior strategy that kept her safe, ensured she received affection, and helped her navigate a really complex, maybe unpredictable environment. It served a really real, very urgent purpose. It actually makes me think of an analogy. So imagine you are caught out in a massive freezing blizzard, and someone hands you this huge, incredibly heavy industrial grade winter coat. You put it on, and it literally saves your life. It protects you from the biting wind and the ice. But then years go by, the storm passes. You're sitting inside a nice, warm, safe room, maybe sipping some tea, and you're still wearing that massive, heavy winter coat. You're sweating, you're uncomfortable, you can barely bend your arms, but you refuse to take it off because your brain has hardwired the belief this coat keeps me safe. That is exactly what happens. The brain is incredibly efficient at holding on to what works, even when an environment completely changes. Neurologically, your amygdala, which is the fear center of the brain, associates that heavy coat or the survival behavior with staying alive. It doesn't know the storm is over. And when survival patterns solidify over decades, they bypass conscious thought entirely. They become automated by the brain's default mode network. You literally forget that taking the coat off is an option because the coat feels like your skin. But when you finally notice the coat and you reach for the zipper, Destiny described the exact moment as incredibly disorienting. Letting go of a survival mechanism, even when you clearly don't need anymore, it triggers these deep, uncomfortable questions. Her narrative asks these really poignant questions. Who am I when I stop proving myself? So, why does something that should be a relief feel so terrifying? Well, if we connect this to a bigger picture, it really comes down to fear of the identity vacuum. When you spend decades performing specific roles, the overachiever, the caretaker, the peacemaker, your brain equates those roles with your fundamental value as a human being. Stripping away those performances doesn't instantly reveal a fully formed, enlightened version of yourself, just standing there in the light. You're just left with the empty space. I dropped the heavy baggage, and suddenly you realize you actually don't know how to walk without that resistance pushing against you. And nature abhors a vacuum, and so does the human ego. If your entire sense of self worth is tied up in the act of proving your value, then stopping feels indistinguishable from disappearing. You are facing the terrifying prospect of having no defined shape. So, if nature abhors this identity vacuum, what do we naturally do? We fill it with archetypes, and the most common archetype we retreat to, which Destiny Story explores in really vivid detail, is the identity of being the strong one. It's one of the most pervasive archetypes in our modern culture. Destiny realized that her entire life architecture was structured around proving she was relentlessly capable. She was the one who could hold absolutely everything together without ever dropping a single plate. She managed the family crises. She took on extra projects at work. She remembered everyone's birthday while functioning on like 4 hours of sleep. And that wasn't just a temporary hat she wore during a busy season, that had become her baseline. She operated on these quiet, insidious agreements like, I shouldn't need help, or I have to be the glue holding this family together. If I rest, everything will fall apart. And those agreements placing a crushing physiological load on the nervous system. You are basically operating in a state of chronic hyperarousal, just constantly scanning for the next crisis. What Destiny reflections do so beautifully is redefine the concept of strength. Because from childhood, we are conditioned to view strength as synonymous with endurance. Like strength is carrying more weight, taking on more responsibility, pushing through pain, never complaining. But I want to push back on that a little bit though, because redefining strength is putting the weight down. Sounds lovely in theory, but let's look at the reality of the world we actually live in. Society relentlessly rewards the strong one archetype. You get promoted at your corporate job precisely because you answer emails at midnight and take on work of two people. You get praised by your family for being the reliable rock who fixes everyone's emotional messes. So if your career and your relationships are fundamentally built on being the person who never breaks, how do you just put the weight down without feeling like you're failing everyone who relies on you? What fascinating here is that destiny anticipated that exact fear. The narrative doesn't suggest that you abandon your responsibilities overnight and just walk away from your life. It focuses intentionally on the mechanics of awareness. The shift didn't happen because she quit her job or cut off her family. The shift happened the moment she began to notice the subconscious agreements, just noticing them. Observation is the wedge that breaks the automatic loop. Just seeing the pattern playing out in real time. Because of how unlearning functions in our brain, when you operate on autopilot, your default mode network is running the show. But the moment you actively notice a behavior, seeing a spike in your heart rate when someone asks you for a favor and you feel compelled to say yes, you pull that action out of the subconscious and into the prefrontal cortex. You force your brain to process it as a choice rather than a reflex. You cannot unsee a pattern once it's brought into conscious awareness. So the goal isn't to stop being capable. It's recognizing the hidden cost of confusing sheer endurance with actual strength. When you realize that holding everyone else's world together is actually causing your own internal world to fracture, putting the weight down stops feeling like a personal failure. It starts feeling like a survival necessity. You realize the tactic that used to keep you safe is now the thing destroying you. It is a profound recalibration of threat. The friction of unlearning really comes from realizing that what feels safe is actually just what feels familiar. So let's get on the practical side of this. You see the heavy pattern. You recognize you're sitting in your living room sweating in the winter coat. You decide you are ready to put the weight down. How does that physically happen? Destiny is very clear that this isn't some movie moment epiphany where the clouds part and suddenly you have an ironclad boundaries, right? It is a slow, gradual, and highly uncomfortable process of observation. Unlearning happens through noticing the friction in ordinary, everyday moments. And the examples in her story are so visceral. It's noticing how panic inducing rest feels when your entire nervous system is conditioned for hustle. Like sitting on your couch at 2 p.m. on a Sunday, doing absolutely nothing and feeling this immense crushing guilt. Your brain is screaming that you should be doing laundry or optimizing your schedule, or I don't know, at least listening to an audio educational book. Well, that guilt is literal feeling of neural pathways resisting change. Your brain is wired to interpret stillness as a vulnerability or consider the discomfort of unfamiliar peace. Unfamiliar peace is when your baseline is tension and crisis management. A lack of drama actually feels dangerous. If there isn't a fire to put out at work, you start subconsciously looking for one, or you create one by overcomplicating a really simple task. I think we've all done that. Or the sheer agony of trying to receive help when your identity is built on giving it. You finally ask a colleague to take over a small task, and they happily say yes, and instead of feeling relief, you feel incredibly exposed and useless. Observing those moments of friction without judgment is what leads to a state that Destiny describes as softening. Softening is a word that is usually weaponized in our modern culture. We equate soft with weak. We think of it as a vulnerability that someone else will exploit. We need to reframe what softening actually means physiologically and psychologically. Softening is not becoming less capable or less intelligent. Softening is the active downregulation of your nervous system. It means the rigid, heavy armor you've been flexing your muscles to hold up starts to yield. You stop treating every incoming email like a tiger in the brush. When the pressure to constantly perform loosens, it reveals the authentic person underneath all that exhausting performative effort. Here's where it gets really interesting because as we are going through this unlearning, we are experiencing the discomfort of soft destiny, dropping what is arguably the most paradigm shifting realization in her entire journey. She says, "You were never broken, you were adapting." That single reframing shifts the entire foundation of personal growth. So often, when we realize we have these deeply ingrained unhealthy patterns like chronic overwork or people pleasing or completely isolating ourselves, the second we feel stressed, our immediate instinct is harsh self criticism. We look at our behavior and think, what's wrong with me? Why am I so messed up? But looking through the lens of adaptation says, stop. You aren't broken. You were just a highly effective learner. You figured out exactly what behaviors you needed to deploy to survive the specific emotional environments you grew up in. You pivot away from shame and move towards objective understanding. And this brings us to the most vital structural distinction in the unlearning process, separating adaptation from identity. And adaptation is just a tool I picked up to solve a problem, but an identity is who I fundamentally am. We are saying the psychological trap is looking at a hammer we've been holding for 20 years and mistakenly believing that we are the hammer. The trap is that you've been gripping the hammer for so long, your hand has literally cramped into the shape of the handle. You think I'm an anxious overachiever, but overachieving was an adaptation you used to feel secure and valuable. Being overly responsible to the point of burnout was a means of maintaining control in a chaotic environment. The behavior isn't the person. And when you separate the two, you gain total agency. You can lay all these adaptations on the table. Just look at them objectively. You can look at the perfectionism, the hyper independence, the people pleasing, and you can consciously survey them. You thank them for their service because they once kept you safe. But then you have the power to choose which tool you actually want to carry into the next phase of your life and which ones you are finally ready to leave on the table. So, what does this all mean? It means that genuine growth isn't just discovering who you are by hoarding new habits and adding more floors to your metaphorical skyscraper. True growth is the deliberate, often uncomfortable process of releasing who you were taught to be. And engaging in that process requires an immense amount of deep, radical honesty. You cannot fake your way through unlearning. You have to be willing to sit in the discomfort of that Sunday afternoon without jumping up to do the dishes. Honesty, patience, and above all, compassion. You cannot hate yourself into a new, healthier version of yourself. You really have to extend grace to every past version of you that worked so incredibly hard and carried so much heavy weight just to get you to where you're sitting right now. Acknowledging the heavy lifting those old survival patterns did is the only way to convince your brain that it's finally safe enough to let them go. I want to leave you with a direct question to reflect on. Think about this as you go on about the rest of your day, maybe on your commute or while you're making dinner. What specific belief about yourself might you be ready to unlearn? And remember the caveat here. You aren't unlearning it because it was wrong at the time. It probably saved you, right? But what belief are you ready to unlearn simply because it no longer fits the person you are actually becoming? This raises an important question, one that builds on everything we've explored today regarding the mechanics of subtraction. We talked earlier about the identity vacuum, that terrifying empty space that appears when we finally drop our old survival rules. The emptiness, perhaps the moments in our lives when we feel most directionless, most uncertain, or most empty aren't actually signs that we are failing or that we've lost our way. So what if emptiness isn't a problem that needs to be frantically solved with more additions? What if emptiness is simply the necessary clearing made by subtraction, a quiet open space that has finally been excavated, patiently waiting for our true unburdened self to step in? So if you're feeling a little empty or disoriented right now, maybe it doesn't mean you're lost. Maybe it means you've finally taken off that heavy winter coat and your body is just adjusting to the strange, lighter feeling of being in a warm room. It's okay to just sit there for a minute and let the warmth in. I'll see you in the next chapter.